Hey folks, David Stewart here. What I'd like to talk a little bit about today is talent stacks or skill stacks and how they apply specifically to those of you who want to be musicians or want to exist in the music industry. I think in 2018 you have a better opportunity than ever before to apply a more diverse set of skills to achieve success. And I think in 2018 you've been required more than ever before to have a diverse set of skills in order to achieve success. If you missed some of my previous content, the idea of a talent stack is rather than being the best at any one given thing, like rather than trying to be Yngwie Malmsteen, you're going to be good at a variety of things that work together synergistically to produce a really good effect. So rather than being the best guitar player, you're going to be a good guitar player that also knows production, good guitar player that's also a good composer. So developing those skills together is what's going to help you achieve success. And I think that that's particularly true in the new economy. Now, before I dig into my little PowerPoint that I've prepared for you, let me say that this is going to focus on people who are interested in the popular music realm, not classical music. Classical music, I would have a completely different set of advice for you. If you want your own advice video for how to be a successful classical musician, I'll give you some really specific advice for that. So let's take a look at it. Talent stacks for music. These are essential skills. There's many skills that you can add to this. There's much knowledge that you can add to what I'm getting at here, but this is the basic stuff that I think will provide the biggest bang for your buck, if you will, for you studying and learning these things. So first of all, I want to talk about the impossible stack that music really requires of people. Because music asks people to be sort of two people in one, a person with high extroversion and a person with high introversion. You have to have a really high amount of extroversion because you have to go out on stage and connect with people. You have to interact with fans. You have to generate interest and be a great showman. That requires a lot of extroversion, a love of the social and the diverse in social matters, talking with lots of different people and being comfortable in those social environments. When you go out on stage, it's a social situation. The high introversion is also required, though, because you have to be able to spend time practicing your craft and working on what you're doing to better yourself. The hours that you spend recording are going to be fairly lonely with maybe no other people around or very few other people around. The time that you spend developing yourself as an instrumentalist or as a vocalist, it's going to be in a practice room or it's going to be by yourself practicing. And you have to have a lot of comfort being able to work on your own or work with a very small set of people in a very intimate setting if you're in a band or something like that, or you're working with a producer. So you have to have these two sides to you, and most people don't have that. Most people are not introverts and extroverts at the same time. So you have to be able to switch between them comfortably if you can. And if you believe that you're a person who is, I'm an introvert and I can't ever be an extrovert, I can't ever walk on stage, I could tell you that you can be whomever you want to be. I'm a pretty introverted person. Most people don't believe me when I say that because I am very assertive. I think I've taken some personality tests and I'm like an INTJ. I'm an assertive personality type, but I'm an introvert. And what that assertiveness really helps me do is to be able to switch modes, if you will, and go out and act extroverted for a while. You can be the person that you want to be. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, particularly when you're starting out, but you have to be able to do both of those things and operate in both of those modes. So that's a little bit of a prerequisite, is being able to do that. Here's some skills that you got to know. So let's talk about the skills. I'm going to break this down into skills and knowledge. So skills, you have to have your instrumental or vocal performance skills and techniques up to par. That means that you got to be able to play guitar if you're a guitar player, and you have to be able to practice. You have to be working to better yourself, and you have to be actively learning all the techniques that you're going to use for your genre. Likewise, if you're a vocal performer, you need to be actively practicing, figuring out how to perform in your genre better and learn all the idioms of your genre, improve your tone, improve your ability to have endurance when you're singing, because eventually you're going to be singing for a long period of time. And all those things should go together. I can make a follow-up video that'll talk about some more really specific things there. I think everybody in music should be able to do some basic vocals and do some basic piano in addition to whatever else they're doing. You don't have to be an advanced vocalist. You don't have to be the best, but some vocal skills are really, really, really useful because you can do backing vocals if you're not a lead vocalist, or if you don't have access to a vocalist, you have the skills to be able to perform the vocals yourself. Those are all really good things. Music composition is another really important skill. In the popular music realm, you are not going to be spending a lot of time playing other people's music unless you're like a manufactured pop star and you have a record company paying someone like David A. Stewart to write songs for you. Different David Stewart. I wish I had his royalty check, but he's a good composer. So if you really want to pick two skills that are going to synergize highly, it's being able to perform well, technically perform well, and being able to compose your music. And music composition is a skill that you can learn, and performances are skills that you can learn. These aren't things that are like inborn talents that you can't ever develop. If you have a small amount of inclination towards creativity as a composer, you can develop that, and as you develop it, you find that you can get more creative as well. So those are two things that I think are really important. Showmanship and public speaking are another one. I mentioned connection with an audience, being able to talk to an audience, being able to talk to fans, being able to have that comfort up in front of people, speaking and communicating with them. Those are some important skills to have, and they kind of go hand in hand. You'll develop them when you get out there and you start practicing, but if you come from a public speaking background, man, it's really easy to just bring it into music and be able to connect with people easier and tell jokes and those sorts of things. Recording and production is absolutely essential in 2018. It wasn't perhaps in days of yore when you were going to have to pay to go into a studio and have access to all that equipment because it was so expensive. But nowadays, production's so cheap that it's pretty much expected everyone's going to be able to do it. Moreover, you're really going to want to be able to have your recordings out in the world doing work for you. In days of yore, it used to be your performance. You'd begin by performing, and then you'd do recording, and then that recording would then gain you more performances. Now you really need to be starting with the recording as well, because that's something that you need immediately for your marketing. When someone's like, oh, am I going to book you? Here's our song. We've already recorded it. We're already ready to go. We already have our album, and then you can sell the album at the shows. So it kind of works the same way, but now I think it's more important than ever to be able to have that recording early on. So you want to have the ability to produce it yourself without a high expense and to produce it at a quality that you think is appropriate. So recording and production techniques are absolutely essential in 2018. I would not overlook them at all. Business practice is another important one. That means knowing how to manage your money, knowing how to track investments and think about your return on investment for things like equipment, things like time spent practicing, those sorts of things, knowing how to negotiate contracts. All of that are skills that are really, really good to have in music and can definitely provide you a lot of benefit over the long run. Graphic design is a minor skill that I recommend, and the reason is, especially when you're starting out, being able to design your own materials is kind of a huge money saver and time saver. Being able to do web design, being able to do design for your videos, design for your albums or your t-shirts, your merchandise, being able to do all that, it's a big money saver, but you don't have to be great at it. You have to know basic stuff, and that can be kind of synergistic, particularly if you plan on selling a lot of merchandise. Marketing is pretty essential, knowing how marketing works, because the idea eventually is that you're going to be able to have some sort of situation where you're able to advertise what you're doing and get people to come see you, get people to buy your album. So understanding marketing in a general sense is pretty good. So if you have a lot of skills in that area, those can benefit you as a musician for sure. And I do recommend knowing some video production now. Even if it's just recording a live show that you do, or recording yourself performing something, or just doing YouTube videos talking about your music, all of that will reinforce, your total product, your 360-degree product, which is required in 2018. There are some knowledge things that I really recommend. The first one is music theory. Music theory is going to be highly synergistic with your composition elements, your production elements, and actually your performance elements, because understanding the theory behind how a particular piece works is kind of a prescription for performance. It kind of tells you what chords you need to emphasize and how you're going to go about doing that. So music theory is something that you really ought to study and gain some knowledge of. You can do it at a community college. The first 4 semesters are probably more than you would ever need of music theory. So you probably really just need the first 2 or 3. You probably don't need to do 20th century music theory, like 12-tone stuff, pitch class theory, set theory, all that stuff. If you're in the popular music realm, it's not there. You can learn it if it's something that really interests you, obviously, that's going to enrich you. It's going to contribute to your total abilities as an artist, but it's not necessary. So the common practice period is that between 17th century and the 20th century, ending with, say, Holst or, Richard Strauss or something like that. Post-romantic, even impressionist stuff, all uses common practice music theory. That's basic chord theory, basic cadences, melody construction, all of that's in common practice. I do have some material to that effect on this channel. And you need to know some genre music theory. So if you're in metal, you need to know what theory is used in metal and be able to analyze that and study it so that then you can sort of synthesize that for your own music. Same thing with jazz theory. So I do think jazz theory is something that any serious musician ought to try to take a little bit of a look at jazz theory, because it's a very different kind of approach than the classical theory, but it uses all of the same building blocks to construct the music. So jazz theory is something I do recommend you pick up. It will definitely enhance your ability to write pop music if you can understand the jazz theory that created pop music, because you're looking at something that's derivative of the blues jazz tradition from the mid 20th century. Another thing that I think is really important are the recording knowledge of your DAW. So DAW is a digital audio workstation, and that's a software suite that can record audio and program MIDI usually. So most of the main ones today are going to be able to do MIDI programming, and they're going to be able to do, microphone recording or guitar recording and run amp simulations and that sort of stuff. You need to know mic placement as well as part of the recording stuff. Which DAW software you use, I'm not going to go into in this video. There's a bunch of options. You have Reaper kind of on the cheaper end, which you can get into for $60, and there's even some free stuff like Audacity, but Reaper's very full featured, so I do recommend that one for like cheap. Then you have more expensive options: Pro Tools, Cubase. Cubase has been an industry standard, I think, particularly in Europe for quite a while now, and it's a very, very solid piece of software and very expansive, though it tends to be a little buggy, and Pro Tools tends to be very buggy. That was industry standard at one point, and now I think a lot of people use Logic, which is will only run on a Mac, but I don't really recommend using a Mac if you want. I'll go into that on a different video when I talk about equipment. So you got to pick a DAW software that you really want to use. I use Ableton for a lot of stuff. I use Reaper for other things. My album was actually recorded on Ableton entirely because I really like the MIDI programming options on it, and it has some great effects on it. So you need to know that stuff. You do need to know, I think, some basic music history. So you need to know your basic periods and kind of what's in them, and be able to listen to music and appreciate more than just what you're operating in your genre, because that's going to be bringing in more elements that you can use as a musician. So it's important to have the ability to understand a little bit outside of what you're doing. But you don't need a huge, super deep understanding of music history. You don't need to know exactly what the fifth movement in Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique meant, or what instrument was playing at the beginning, although I could tell you that because I'm thinking of it. But you don't really need to know that if you're going to be a popular music musician. You also need to know genre orchestration and instrumentation. So if you're in jazz band, you need to know jazz orchestration. If you're going to try to do a big band or something like that. If you're in a metal band, you need to understand how the metal instruments work and their ranges and those sorts of things so that you can compose well for them. That's the basic knowledge. You don't need to know, violin stuff if you're not composing for violins. Additional stuff, this is more business stuff. You need to know basic tax law, how to file your taxes. You're going to be self-employed for most of your career, and you need to be knowledgeable so that you don't end up where I ended up when I was 19, which is writing a check to the government that was my everything I had in my bank account, because I didn't realize how expensive it can be to be self-employed, and I wasn't very good at saving money, so I learned from my mistakes pretty quickly when I ended up completely broke because of having to pay my taxes. So learn some tax law and learn how to save some money. Learn some basic marketing techniques, of course. Know how to operate on social media. Know how the industry distributes its music. You can learn a lot about that, and maybe I can create a presentation that's more directly on that. And should know some basic management and booking standards, meaning how much per diem are you going to pay people? How do you book a tour? How do you negotiate for that? Learning, it varies by genre, so I can't give too much specific information, but knowing, if you have a guarantee from a club, how many people they are expecting you to bring for that and that sort of stuff. All of that goes into the knowledge pool. Now, the strongest synergy that you can make, I think, in music, I'm going to list a couple really strong ones and some cases I think of that. So the strongest synergy I think is actually composition and performance technique. That is being able to compose pretty good music and being able to be a pretty good performer. Pink Floyd I think is a great example of this. Pink Floyd is not made of the best musicians in terms of their technical abilities. They're technically proficient and maybe technically masters even. And their compositions are also really good, but it's how those things go together that makes that music so good. If Pink Floyd was performed, if you take Pink Floyd's music and perform it by another band, it doesn't quite have the same impact because it's not those guys. But another band is also not going to compose music as good as Pink Floyd's. Metallica is actually, I think, a good example of this, particularly early Metallica. It's a good combination of performance and composition. They were solid performers. They're also solid showmen, and they were also good at business. That's one of the reasons that they succeeded. And it took them a while to be hyper successful. But they were also, good at the composition element. They wrote really good songs. Rush is a really good example. They're very, very competent performers and very, very, very competent composers. But I think for a lot of people who are super into prog, you take Rush and you say Rush compared to Yes. You're like, well, Yes is technically, they're more technically proficient. They're better technical musicians. But Rush, they don't write songs nearly as catchy as Rush, or as they have as big an impact on you because of their good lyrics. So Rush is a great combination of that. Ed Sheeran is one of these newer act, but I think he's a really good example of this. Is that he's a good performer and a decent composer, but how those things go together is what makes Ed Sheeran popular, I think. It's the synergy between those. And you don't have to like his music to appreciate that he has those two skill sets and he's executing them very well. Neil Young's another classic example of a singer-songwriter. A good performer, a good songwriter, but the fact that those two things go together makes his music have the impact I think that it has. And you can think of many, many more examples. So if you think of more examples, leave them in the comments below, because each of these sort of synergy things, I think there's a million examples for. Performance technique and showmanship. These are like the mega stars. So Queen, like Freddie Mercury, extremely flamboyant showman, but also very technically proficient with his voice, and a very, very good singer. And those two things combined, I think, is what made Queen the superstars that they are and were. And it's kind of like lightning in a bottle. You can never have quite that combination of that great showman and that great technique that he had. But certainly you could make, if you're being very honest, you could make the case that there might be better showmen out there and there might be better vocalists, but it's the fact that he's super good at those two things. Michael Jackson likewise was a very, very competent showman and okay at his performance technique. So he's good at performance technique and very good at his showmanship, but those two things went together to make him the superstar. He not really that much of a composer though. Right, he's not a big composer. He always had other composers working with him to write his music for him or write his music with him. Prince is a good example. He's also a composer too, so he might be a good example of how a lot of these things combine. But certainly a great showman. Stevie Ray Vaughan, that's SRV. Very, very impressive showman outside of that pop genre, in the blues genre. Kind of was a big star in blues for a while. Didn't write, half the songs he played were cover songs. And the songs that he did write were okay, but it's the way that he performed them. Like other people performing Stevie Ray Vaughan songs, it's not the same as him doing it. Performance in business is actually highly synergistic. These are the guys who are in the business for a long time and have consistently made money. And I chose Megadeth and Frank Zappa for this. I'm sure you can think of a million other bands like Rolling Stones or something like that. But Megadeth in particular, Dave Mustaine's not the best vocalist in the world. He's a competent composer. In fact, I think he's a good composer. I think Metallica's earlier compositions are probably better than Megadeth's early compositions, even though Dave Mustaine composed a good deal of the material. It's the fact that Dave Mustaine and the Megadeth machine has been going on so long and has been so consistent and has toured so well and has been so good with their business and so good with their money. And in fact, David Ellefson had a music business series here on YouTube. I don't know if he ever finished it, but you can look it up, and it's actually got a lot of really good information on it. Another one was Frank Zappa, and he was notorious for being able to just sort of run his music business, being able to tour and being kind of harsh on people and firing them when they weren't living up to the standards that he set for his band. And last one that I'll mention is production and composition. This is definitely a newer thing to emerge that you can be highly synergistic with. Deadmau5, Aphex Twin. Aphex Twin, of course, goes back to the 80s, and was one of the first guys I can think about that was an electronic musician that was very popular. And Deadmau5 is very popular as well. These aren't guys that are great performers, right? They're mainly composing music and very good at the production side to produce theirs. And then I did also think of one other metal guy, and that's Devin Townsend, who's really good at producing his own albums. If you ever listen to Ziltoid the Omniscient, it's an album he recorded basically in his bedroom after his kid was born, all on his own, and produced it completely by himself, and it sounds awesome. He knows all the stuff that goes into a great composition and a great rock composition, as well as all the stuff that goes into producing it extremely well to have high fidelity and great impact. So these are all the ones that just came to mind to me when I was making the PowerPoint. I'm sure you can think of others, so tell me down below. These are just the ones that kind of popped up on the top of my head. Now, if you want to think about the stuff you probably don't need to know, it's a lot of the stuff that you might pick up in a music degree. And you're going to realize that a lot of the classes just aren't going to be, they're going to be superfluous for you if you want to operate as a popular musician. So conducting, you're not leading an orchestra, you don't need conducting. And yet, if you take a music degree, you'll probably have to take at least 2 semesters of it. 20th century music, that's usually like 3rd, 4th semester of music theory and beyond. Excluding jazz theory usually isn't taught, but there's some places that now teach jazz theory, which is cool. I would recommend jazz theory, but you don't need to know 12-tone technique unless you want to use it. So learn the techniques that you want to learn, that you want to use. Band or orchestra arranging, you don't need to really know that because you're not arranging for those instruments. So you don't need to know the range of the flute if you're not writing for flute. You don't need to know advanced keyboard stuff. You don't need to be practicing Franz Liszt to be the world's best piano player, because you won't be. It's really hard to be the world's best piano player. You should be a little bit proficient with it, and if it's your main instrument, you should be good at it and actively practice it. But you should definitely be investing in these other skills as well. So you don't need to be a concert keyboardist or concert pianist. You don't need to know a lot of the ensemble literature. You don't need to be taking literature classes in band and stuff like that, because you're just not going to use them. And you don't need to know in-depth music history. I mentioned you don't need to know what instrument. Now, if you could tell me what instrument opens up, very special instrument opens up Hector Berlioz's 5th movement of Symphonie Fantastique, I'll give you a free book. So if you're the first person to tell me in the comments what instrument I'm thinking of, I'll give you a free book or something. So you don't need to know that though. It's mostly, now you can learn all this stuff if you want to learn it, and it's going to enrich you, but it's not necessary. Okay. Here's some basic equipment. You need a computer capable of running a DAW with ease, and I added the words "with ease" are important. So you don't want to be trying to run your music production on like a Chromebook, and you probably don't want to be running on like any kind of cheap laptop either. You want to build a good computer. Just you can use mine as an example. My computer is now 3 years old. I built it the way it is now. It's got an 8-core Intel processor, like i7 processor. It's got 64 gigs of RAM. I overbuilt it, but sometimes these programs like these, like a DAW program, can use a lot of resources up. So you really don't want to underbuild a machine. You don't want to look at the technical requirements of the DAW you want to use and just get that. You want to double it if you can. So if it says, oh, it requires 16 gigs of RAM or it requires 8 gigs of RAM, you want to double or quadruple that if you can, and get as much headroom above that as you can, because you don't want to end up in this position where Yari Mimpa was trying to create Time 1 and Time 2, where they're literally, his computer couldn't handle the music he'd written for the album. It couldn't handle all the different tracks of orchestra, synths, and all kinds of stuff like that. He had to get a new computer to try to finish the album, and it still couldn't handle it. And part of it was that he was buying Macs. But if you overbuild your computer insanely, not insanely, but you overbuild it quite a bit, then it's going to run that DAW with ease. You never want your limitation to be the computer that you bought. So if you're capable of buying a good computer, you can. If you don't have that available, you actually can do music production on a Chromebook, but it's not really what I recommend. So the most important thing is having a computer that's capable of doing what you want. And if you're going to be doing any video editing, you're going to want a little bit better computer too. A digital audio workstation of your choice, you can get into them as cheap as free. There are some free ones, and you can spend as little as $60 for a really full-featured one in Reaper. Find the one that you think works best. I think you could try out Reaper for free, so that's always a good one to try out and see if you can figure out what you're doing. You need a good set of headphones and studio monitors. These are old and falling apart. I need new ones, but they've served me well. These are AKG K240 Studios. You can get them for like $50 or $60, and they're great. You don't want to use like Beats by Dre because they color the sound too much. And you don't want to be using like, I don't know, AirPods or something to try to do this production. You're not going to hear a good representation of sound. You'll know the difference in the quality when you get a good set of headphones and a good set of monitors. Those are the speakers that you use. You're also going to want a midline quality guitar at least. You don't want to be trying to do things on like $100 Squire, and that's just because the limitations of the instrument will be really present and really easy to run into. You know, the fact that the frets aren't milled quite nice and you're like cutting your hand on them, or you have to like learn you have to pay somebody money to set the guitar up so it's more playable. So midline quality, that's going to be, not like Squire, maybe Mexican Fender, $500 guitar is what I recommend. If you're doing guitars, you need an amplifier midline quality, loud enough to be heard in a full ensemble setting. But you don't need to spend $3,000 on basically the amplifiers I have, which I don't even use that much anymore. You don't have to buy the new like Angle Powerball to play guitar. You can buy a cheap digital amp and run a multi-effects processor, computer-based effects for your guitar, and it'll probably sound pretty close to just as good. It'll sound pretty good, and it's going to cost a whole lot less money. And then you can, if you have a lot of extra money, you can buy more expensive equipment later on. You do need a recording interface. I use Focusrite interfaces. There's a whole bunch of them out there. There's more than I can even talk about, with more features than I can even talk about. You want one that's capable of at least 2 inputs. Okay. You do want some microphones. I use a whole bunch of mics. The one that you're hearing right now is a Rode NT1A, one of the original NT1As from like right when they came out 15 years ago. They're great microphones for pretty much everything you'd want to do with them. You also want some dynamic mics to mic up cabinets or something if you want. So you do need to have a couple of microphones. You do want a PA for live performances, so you don't have to, because you may want to play in a venue that doesn't have a PA. So a PA that's loud enough to overpower drums, meaning the drums are playing at an acoustic volume and your PA is loud enough that the vocals are the same volume. That's as loud as a PA as you really, really need. And if you want to go louder than that, you can, but that's like the basic level. Okay. And of course, you're going to need some graphic software. This can be free, so you can do Inkscape and GIMP can accomplish most of what you need to do for promotional material. So you can do that for free, but you will need some. You're going to need cables to hook stuff up, obviously, so you have to think about that. I mean, I've known people that buy an amp and then they're like, how much are the cables? And the cables are like $20 a piece. And they're like, oh my God, I didn't budget for $50 worth of cables. And you do need like a MIDI keyboard or control surface for programming. I'd highly recommend that. Rather than trying to click stuff. I know deadmau5 actually does click in drums, but I play the drums in either on a keyboard or with an electronic drum set. So having a MIDI keyboard surface enables you to perform in your MIDI sequencing if that's something that you want to do, and it's really helpful for a whole bunch of things. So I do highly recommend that. Backing up just a little bit, multi-effects processor versus a big pedal board. Multi-effects processor is going to be cheaper and it's going to suit your needs early on. It's really hard to collect all kinds of good pedals for any kind of reasonable amount of money, but that's something you can do later on as you continue to add to your equipment. And optional, you can do score writing software. Most people are not going to need score writing software for what I'm talking about, so it's kind of optional, but it's really useful if you're going to be in jazz, for instance, or you're going to be anywhere that you're going to be giving music to other musicians or expecting them to record or play with you. Score writing software is good. That's going to be like Finale, Sibelius, but there's free options available as well. And here's some stuff, how to waste your time. Attempting mastery instead of proficiency before beginning your professional endeavors. What this means is you're going to practice. I'm going to go and I'm going to practice until I'm as good as Yngwie Malmsteen, and then I'll think about performing. Well, you're going to miss out on a lot of lessons. You're going to miss out the important lessons of business and failure, how to bomb in front of a crowd, and in some cases, you can spend so long practicing music, you go take it out to perform it to people, and they don't care about it, and you realize that you haven't written music to the market. You've kind of missed a really important lesson, which is, do people like this music? So you want to be performing once you hit proficiency, and you will develop mastery as you're doing this. That's the way I look at it. So proficiency is what's going to get you out there to have performances that people think are good. Most people are actually not adequately prepared to judge the difference between a proficient player and a player who has like high mastery of their instrument. And of course, if you're a composer, you can compose down to your particular performance level anyway. So you don't want to be that guy who spends 8 years in the practice room only to never really get out on stage. And I've known so many musicians who just waste time trying to perfect everything about their live act before they will play live. And they're missing out on money, they're missing out on experience, they're missing out on exposure, and most people are not going to notice a couple mistakes anyway. And most importantly, you're missing out on all the experience of figuring out how to negotiate contracts, and also how to actually screw up. Because you can be a great player and go out and screw up and completely be thrown off. And you can only learn how to recover from that by being on stage and doing it. And those are really, it's something you just can't learn in a practice room. Don't try to duplicate Black Swans like Beatles or Nirvana. Black Swans are these highly unpredictable events that are also highly impactful. So the Beatles, after the fact, we can see kind of what made the Beatles success. But as the Beatles were becoming successful, no one really knew why. That's a fact. You couldn't have found the Beatles in 1962 and said, you guys are going to be the biggest thing on planet Earth. I don't think anyone really predicted that. Certainly not the people like paying them to play in Germany. So don't try to duplicate the Beatles either in form or function. Don't be like, oh, we're going to be the next big thing by being super unique, because it could just not catch on. You don't know like what is going to be the combination of novelty that's going to like blow you up. Same thing with Nirvana. Nirvana was not something that people could easily have predicted would be as successful as it was. So don't try to duplicate the Black Swans. You'll mostly be wasting your time. Focus on being good at what you're doing and doing what you care about, and you'll even if you achieve moderate success, it's okay, right? And this is the mistake that I have certainly made probably multiple times over the course of my career. Investing in expensive equipment without first buying an entry-level set of equipment for each need. So in other words, you buy a really nice guitar, but you have a really bad amp. That's not going to showcase the great sound of that guitar. You need a good amp and a good guitar. They have to match in terms of quality. And in fact, it's more important to have a good amp in certain styles, like metal. You could play a $100 Squire into a Mesa Boogie dual rec, and it's probably going to sound 80% as good as any guitar plugged into it, because the amp is doing so much work. So you got to buy a good guitar and a good amp. Don't Don't have one without the other. Likewise, don't be spending all your money on guitars if you don't have a recording interface, if you don't have microphones, if you don't have headphones, if you don't have all this other stuff, if you don't have a good computer. In fact, if it's like, oh man, I really want to buy this new Les Paul. And it's like, what computer do you have? It's like, oh, I have this MacBook from 2009. It's like, you need to spend the money on a new computer and keep your garbage guitar around, because the computer is going to do way more work for you than a new Les Paul will or any guitar will. So have at least an entry-level set of all the equipment and know how to actually properly prioritize your equipment. I've been really bad about this in the past. Buying really nice guitars and not having amps that match it. Having really nice mics, but not having a computer good enough to run the DAW that I want. And now I finally have all the good equipment, or having a really outdated, cheap garbage interface with bad preamps, running really nice microphones. You try to get everything at the same level, even if it's basic or, midline quality is what I try to shoot for, like middle of the road. Then it's actually going to produce a much better effect than if you had a great mic and a bad interface, or vice versa. Great interface, bad mic. Okay mic, okay interface. Boom! It's going to sound way better than having one bad element in there on either side. So that's mostly what I have to say about that. Hopefully that's an informative little bit of an introduction to this idea, specifically with music. I will create more content that goes into some of these specific things. If you want to know more about the equipment I use, I can talk about some of the really specific equipment I use, the equipment I used to record this album, Memories Adrift, my weird little minimalist album from last year. It's kind of minimalist rock, or maybe you call it ambient rock. I had a lot of fun recording it, and I learned a lot with it. Obviously, it's not a flawless product. It was my first album attempting doing everything by myself, and I had a great time doing it though. So you could check that out if you want at zulonline.com or davidvstewart.com. And if you want more information on the kind of stuff that I've done, and if you want something on classical music in particular, I can do that as well. So leave me your thoughts down below, and I will talk to you guys next time.